rest, let me just make a quick setting for Facebook. And then, oops, and then Instagram. Ooh. Let's see. All right, there we go. Let's go live on Facebook as well. Hello, everybody. One thing I still have to do, go live on Instagram. Let's see how long that's going to take. I will ask you for a moment of patience. There we go. There we go. There we have another one. There we have another one. Or maybe not Instagram. Yes, now it works too. So we are live everywhere for another weekend or end of the week installment of live storytelling here on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you watch it or don't. Okay. The story today, I thought I'll just look at a story that has been told 100 times, 1,000 times, has been an inspiration for artists for a very, very long time. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus and Eurydice, or Orpheus and Eurydice, as would roughly be Greek pronunciation of both of their names. And I hope that most people know that story. I know today, especially for younger people, it's probably not as present what the story is, but this is one of the stories that you can reasonably expect people to know. And since this story is so well known, I'm not just going to tell the story, but also a little bit of the background, the behind the story bits. And we have to start with behind the story stuff, not just with the story. First of all, how old is that story, really? It's an old Greek myth. I mean, how old are they? Anybody got any idea? Probably not. I didn't before I checked it out. So the story, or rather the characters in the story, are very old. The story itself, not so old, maybe 1st century BC. Pointing back to characters, or the people who wrote stories then copied stories from older stories, who copied them in turn from even older stories, and so on and so forth. Probably back to the beginning of time and storytelling. However, the first appearance of the story is from a text called Bibliotheca, which is a collection of various Greek myths. We have a version of them in there, and this one is from the 4th century BC. So the version of the story that we know now is usually the one from 1st century BC, 1st century AD, written by the great Greek writers. Ovid did a version, and others did as well. So even back in Greek times, it was used for plays, for philosophy, moralizing, etc., etc. But what about the characters? What about Orpheus? Well, who is Orpheus in the story that we all know? In the story that we all know, Orpheus is the Protean rock star. He is the greatest musician and poet that ever existed. He can, his emotions flow through his fingers into the musical instruments that he plays, and he can use music as a truly universal language to communicate with anything and everything, anyone and everyone, and to connect to the natural world around him. Whatever Orpheus wants to do, however he wants to manipulate people into feeling, into doing, he can do this through music. A genius and a lyre on his musical instrument, and a master of many things, music and poetry. So that's him. Then we have Eurydice, his wife, to be. And Eurydice has one great disadvantage, which I will get to a little bit later in the story. So we cannot really say very much about her. She was kind. Sometimes she is a wood nymph in the story. Sometimes she is not. Just a regular human being. Orpheus, however, is not a regular human being. He is the son of Calliope, one of the muses, in our story at least. And his father, well, his progeny on his father's side is a little less clear. Sometimes it is a king here and there, and sometimes it is the god Apollo himself. Maybe in disguise, maybe not in disguise. Anyway, both his parents connect him to music. Originally, though, like in 4 BC and earlier, Orpheus is the oldest character in this story. So as a mythical being, Orpheus is the oldest thing that exists in that particular story. He goes back before 4 BC, I think, because even then people were aware of various Orphic songs, Orphic hymns, and Orphic bits and pieces that belong to an older cult, where Orpheus was used in some pre-Christian rituals, ways of living, ways of thinking, ways of behaving, some of which were connected to darker parts, perhaps, of creativity of the human psyche, as people back then would understand it. So there are many Orphic hymns that haven't been preserved. We don't really know what these Orphic hymns are, but as late as last century, people still referred to the Orphic hymns as the pinnacle of poetry. So Orpheus was probably some form of god at some point, the god of music, most likely. Sometimes he's also connected with medicine and other stuff. He certainly is older than Apollo, who is usually the guy who should inspire Orpheus, at least in the stories that you know. But Orpheus is actually probably a predecessor of Apollo. Apollo also being god of inspiration and to some degree of music. And a very clear sign of that is in the story, Apollo gives Orpheus his lyre, his musical instrument, and is so being put on a higher level than Orpheus, which is something that storytellers usually do when they want to, make a newer god appear more powerful and older than an older god. That much for Orpheus. Eurydice herself, a bit younger. And Eurydice probably first appeared as one of the names of the goddess Hecate, or Hecate, the goddess of crossroads, of witches and dark magic. And so also connected to the underworld. And from that, it was only a little step to get to the character of Eurydice as you know it in the story. So much for the history of those characters. But let's jump right into the story itself. Where does the story start? With a marriage. So Orpheus, rock star of the Greek world, has decided to marry the girl Eurydice. He's very much in love with her. And they have a big celebration of their wedding. And now at this wedding, there is also one guest who has a little bit of a fluid identity because he differs from story to story in who he actually is. Sometimes he's a satyr, like this goat, half man creature with cloven hoofs, hairy legs and horns. And sometimes he is a deity himself, an agricultural god, so a farming god, basically. His name is Aristeos. And this guy sometimes has a connection to Orpheus. Let's say he has, because that makes the story a bit more interesting. So he might also be a son of Apollo, so perhaps the two are half-brothers. Aristeos is the older one. He takes care of Orpheus. And basically perhaps also serves as a foster father. Apollo is a father, certainly is never there, apart from giving musical instruments as gifts, like a classical absentee father. So Aristeos is there. He and Orpheus grew up together. Now Aristeos sees his younger half-brothers betrothed for the first time, and Aristeos falls in lust immediately. He wants Eurydice. And so he does some kind of ruse. He tells Eurydice that there's something that he wants to tell her, but he can't really tell it in front of everybody, and would she perhaps come with him just for a moment so he could tell her that? And Eurydice, being kind, follows Aristeus, and he takes her somewhere in a secluded spot, maybe to a cave or something, and there he tries to rape her. He just forces himself on her, and he just wants her, and he just thinks the best way to do that is to take her. And Eurydice, of course, will have nothing of that. She pushes him away, shouts, curses him, and runs away, chased by Aristeus. And so she runs through the grass, trying to get back to the group of celebrants, and she doesn't watch where she's going and steps on a snake, a poisonous snake, a viper, and the viper curls up, hisses, and bites Eurydice in the ankle and the foot. She's poisoned. For a couple of minutes, she lies there regretting her most recent decisions in life, and then she expires. And that is the great problem that Eurydice has in this story, that she's dead for most of it. So it's very hard to figure out what her character is like. Didn't stop people from trying to do that, as we will see a little closer towards the end. But Eurydice is gone. Let's assume for a moment Eurydice wouldn't die. The story would have been completely different and a lot more awkward, because she would have run to Orpheus and told him, hey, your half-brother just tried to rape me. And then what happens then? Is the wedding still on? Does it make for very awkward family connections? What happens to Aristeus? Does Orpheus have to battle Aristeus or kick him out, or does he have to decide between those two, or something like that? Very, very complicated. So for the sake of the story, it's much better that Eurydice died from a snake bite. At least emotional connections were a bit clearer and cleaner. And for Orpheus, the emotional aftermath of that is quite horrible. But let's imagine what happens then. Aristeus sees dead Eurydice there, and he comes to his senses, like the blood comes back to his head, and he thinks, oh, what the hell have I done? And over there, where all the crowd is, they were waiting for Eurydice to come. So they were going to go through the marriage rites. So Orpheus stands there, and everybody is gathered around him, and they're all waiting for Eurydice to come. And then Aristeus comes running, and everybody looks at him and thinks, what the hell is this guy doing here? And you can only hope for Aristeus' sake that he would still be panicking enough not to notice all the stares and just run up to Orpheus and fall on his knees and take Orpheus' hand and says, Orpheus, something horrible happened. Eurydice. And so that would be that. Orpheus knows now that his wife-to-be will never be his wife. She is dead. And he falls into despair, of course. And it takes a long time for him to have any other thoughts. I mean, he's still a great musician. Whenever he plays something, this music, even one note or a melody, it's all so full of sadness that whoever hears the music that he plays falls into the most blissful sort of sadness, like a wonderful melancholy. And that. But now, what happens here in our world if somebody that we love dies? We imagine, most of us would imagine that they go to heaven, that they go to paradise. And perhaps some of us also imagine that we will see them again when we die. Now, let's imagine something different. Imagine that you could physically go to the place where your dead loved one is. Would you do it? Because that's the world in which Orpheus exists. He knows where Eurydice is. She is a shade in the underworld, and he knows that he can get to the underworld. The way will be difficult, the way will be dangerous, and it's possible that he will never return, but he can go there. So for him, it is not a question. He will go to the underworld and he will get Eurydice. He doesn't plan very much, so that's his plan. He will go to the underworld and he will get Eurydice back. So, all right then. How does he get to the underworld? The Greeks believed that there were actual physical gates to the underworld. Well, probably not everybody believed that there were actual physical gates, but some people believed in those actual physical gates to the underworld so much that they marked them on a map. So there are several entrances to the underworld marked on old Greek maps. I don't exactly remember where they were, but usually you look for fissures, any ways that goes down deep into darkness. If steam or sulfurous smoke rises out of this fissure or cave, all the better. You have a perfect way, perfect gate to the underworld. So Orpheus goes to one of these gates to the underworld and he starts to walk down. And the way is long, and the way is dark, and the way is lonely. He plays a little bit of music to, well, not exactly cheer him up, because he's so sad he cannot play anything but sad music, but he walks, and he walks for days, and the first creature he meets is Charon, the ferryman. And perhaps you have seen this in depictions of dead bodies in Greek time or in some fantasy, that they would put coins on the eyes of the dead. Those coins would be to pay passage for the ferryman, but the Greeks didn't put it on the eyes. The eyes are just a visual thing, because you probably saw it in the movie. They could more easily represent coins on the eyes, looks better. What the Greeks did, they would put a coin, an obolos, in the mouth of the deceased. So when the soul would come all disoriented, because it's dead now, and stumble there, and then suddenly this tall ferryman would appear in front of it and ask for an obolus, for a coin, the soul would go, what? And then I'm sorry, start coughing, and then realize, I coughed up a coin. Is that an obolus? And Charon, who has done this a million times, would take the coin and not say anything and ferry them across. Orpheus, not being dead, has brought something else for Charon, a missel twig. And that's a ritual, that's a gift for a ritual usually. And Charon is really surprised and actually quite touched by this, that somebody thinks of him so highly, regards him so highly, that they would bring him a twig of missel. So he would take the missel, invite Orpheus into his skiff, and starts ferrying him across. And while they ferry over the river Styx, Orpheus begins to play his lyre and sings a little sad song. And then he gets out of the boat, and he only realizes that it affected Charon after he looks back, because the ferryman is hunched over, sits on a rock, doesn't move, doesn't say anything. And for the first time in millennia, this is the first break that Charon takes in millennia, because he has to just deal with what he has heard just now. So sad, so beautiful. Orpheus continues, and the next obstacle that he meets is Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell. And this is a little more difficult, because here Orpheus just plays something very calming, and so one after the other, those three heads start to yawn and lie down, and Cerberus falls asleep, makes way for Orpheus to continue into the underworld proper. And now, after more than 2 days, he is in the underworld proper, filled with shades, vast, giant halls. And those shades, you have to understand, those shades are no longer human. For one thing, you cannot even see them clearly enough to figure out who they once were. They're just shadowy, maybe translucent, not quite there. And the only connection they have to who they once were is perhaps a memory, a strong memory that they had. And only those who had really strong memories and connections, they still repeat this memory endlessly and endlessly. So these halls of the dead are like a vast and very, very quiet insane asylum, where people sit in the corner, keep repeating the same phrases and so on, and shadows flit about here and there. It's quiet, it's spooky, it's dark, it's vast, and you recognize nobody. However, the shades notice when somebody who is living comes among them, and so they are very curious, and they crowd around and they gather around Orpheus. And Orpheus slowly makes his way through the shades, looking for his Eurydice, and he is despairing a little bit, because he stares at the shades and he can't tell them apart, and he doesn't know how he could find his beloved among them. And although the shades, one shade, if he watches you will not notice very much of that, but the attention of thousands of these shades is oppressive. It's very oppressive to Orpheus, so he does the only thing that calms him down. He begins to play music. And because he's really nervous and really fearful, he plays a full song. He starts to sing. And as he sings, and as the music plays, this music, the feeling that he puts into it, don't forget, he's the greatest, most accomplished, the best sort of singer. This feeling spreads to the dead, and they are filled with a deliciously sweet sadness. And for a moment, they realize all the pain and all the joy of once having lived. And this emotion spreads through shade after shade after shade after shade, through the entire hall, through thousands, perhaps millions of shades of the dead. This feeling spreads, flows along with the music, and they all remember something about their lives, and they all start to weep. And so his hall filled with weeping. Hades, of course, realizes that something happened. At first he doesn't know, he's in some completely other part, but he follows this trail of emotion until he hears the music, and he comes ever closer, and even he is strangely moved by this music. Persephone, his wife, is already there, and Persephone hates being in the underworld anyway, so this music reminds her of the earth that she has left, and she's already bawling her eyes out, and Hades eventually finds the source of all this distraction and noise, this little bard, this tiny musician, frail-looking guy who plays and sings his soul and heart out in the middle of all those milling shades. "Who are you, bard?" asks Hades. "I am Orpheus," says Orpheus, quite evidently. Orpheus, what are you doing here?" "I am looking for Eurydice." "Eurydice? Who is Eurydice?" "Among all of those, how should I know who this is?" "She is my love, and I'm here to take her back." Hades is himself taken aback by this strange creature that has appeared here, and he looks around and he sees everybody weeping. He looks a little further and he sees not only the shades of weeping, but all the other creatures that live and exist and work in the underworld too. And to his great surprise, even the Furies, even those embodiments of hatred and revenge and anger, even they sit quietly for a moment and start to sob and wipe their cheeks. And this, although Orpheus doesn't know it yet, this proves to be a lethal mistake, for the Furies will never forgive him that he once made them weep. And so they, and not just they, but the Maenards, their acolytes, will later be the creatures that would kill Orpheus, would cause his demise, would rip him to pieces. But he doesn't know that yet. Right now he has other pressing matters on his mind. He tries to explain to Hades who Eurydice is and why she's so important and why she has to come back with him. But Hades doesn't listen. He's already deep in thought, and he says, well, this creature caused such a commotion here. Well, he deserves something, for sure. And so he goes back to his book where he has all the souls catalogued and written down, and he looks for the name of Eurydice. When he finds her, he summons Eurydice. And he says to Orpheus, "You've caused a great commotion and distraction in my orderly halls, and I am not one to forgive such a thing. But your directness of purpose and emotion is moving. I cannot deny it, so here is Eurydice. I will give her to you. But there is one condition. You will walk back the way you came, and you will not turn around. If you turn around, Eurydice will stay here." And with this, Hades disappears and says, "Go." And Orpheus doesn't even know if this shade that he saw for a moment is his Eurydice. He doesn't know if this shade follows him at all. He walks because Hades commanded him to walk, and he walks back the way he came from. He walks up, and this will be the loneliest and longest walk of his entire life. The beginning, he is sure, because his emotion carries him. He's sure that he has made it and that Eurydice is indeed following him, but doubts come and doubts creep in. And Orpheus starts to listen, and he's not sure if the footsteps and the echoes of the footsteps that he hears are one pair of footsteps or two pair of footsteps. And he listens ever harder, whether he hears a sigh or some noise behind him. But there is nothing, or if there is, perhaps it's his imagination. And he doesn't dare to play even one note, out of fear that he would miss a noise from whoever is following or not following behind him. And he starts to think that perhaps Hades played a trick on him and made fun of him, that he was cruel, and that he never sent Eurydice back with him. Or that if Eurydice was sent, perhaps she didn't want to come. Perhaps she didn't want to be with him after all. Perhaps she had found freedom in death. And more doubts and more thoughts come, and he tries to push them away, but the way is long, the way is dark, the way is lonely. So he cannot help but doubt and doubt some more as he walks along, and he has nothing whatsoever, nothing at all behind him. And he walks and he walks and he walks and he doubts and he doubts and he doubts. But after 2 days, eventually he comes up and he sees the exit. And this now is the crucial moment of the entire story. And there are different reasons, or rather different motivations, that people ascribe to Orpheus. In one, he walks out into the light, into the sun, and he's so excited that he turns around, not knowing that the rules stipulate that both of them would have to be outside. In another one, his doubts overcome him just before he takes the last couple of steps, and he turns around. In another one, he's sure that he heard something, somebody cry out, a call of pain, and he turns around to help. Whatever the reason, he, Orpheus, he turns around. And here, I have to pause this a little bit to go to another part. Here, I thought that this moment is so fascinating. This has always fascinated me. That moment before Orpheus decides to turn around. Like, this is the crucial moment in the entire story for me. And it reminded me of something completely unrelated, or rather two unrelated things, one more than the other. And the one is, in certain Buddhist temples, they build a closed room in the middle, in the center of the temple, and they completely close it up. Nobody will ever go into that room. There is no door, there is no window, and if there is a door, the door is locked and it doesn't have a key. And they say this is the room where Buddha is. And it's important that nobody goes in there to check whether Buddha is in there. Because if somebody were to check, obviously they would find out there is nobody in there. But if nobody checks, well, Buddha could be in there. And that's that same moment. Or the other moment, although if anybody knows physics better than I do, they will probably say this is different. It's the idea of Schrödinger's cat, the cat in the box that is both dead and alive at the same time. But you can only hold these two states in your mind, or like in your thesis, for as long as you don't check. So this is the most crucial moment. This is the moment there. And this is the most relatable moment for me in it. This idea that you have to hang on to that. You have to hang on to this moment. To believe, even if you have no reason to believe, and all of that. Or even if what you believe is completely ridiculous. That one single moment was what made the story for me. But that moment passes. We know in the story, Orpheus turns around, and for a split second he sees Eurydice. She reaches out to him, and then she's drawn back into darkness, and she disappears forever, and she's gone. Now, to end it, there is also one interpretation from a French poet, I believe, who was thinking about what would Eurydice feel as she walks after Orpheus. So you have to imagine that Eurydice, the last thing that she remembers from her life was that she was about to be married. So it's like the way to the altar. And that's what plays on in her mind. For those 2 days that she walks behind Orpheus, this is like 2 days that she spends walking to the altar. 2 days from a normal life to another life, life-altering decision. And all the thoughts that go through her head, that whether she wants to be with this man, whether she should be with this man, what sort of life they will have. And since she has so much time, she imagines so many things, so many different outcomes, so many different lives. Some wonderful, some mundane, some horrible, some tragic, some cruel, some the most beautiful that she could ever imagine. So for 2 days, she imagines all of these things. And then, just before the exit, she realizes something. She realizes that whatever is going to happen in reality, in real life, it's not going to surprise her. Because she has imagined all of these things. Whatever happens, it will not top the lives that she has already lived in her imagination. And so she watches Orpheus for another couple of steps, knowing that those are the last steps that she will ever see him take. And just before he exits the cave, she calls out to him, and she shouts, "Turn around," knowing full well that as soon as he will hear her voice, he will turn around. Thank you very much for listening. Story of Orpheus and Eurydice. I'll talk to you again next week with something else. Who knows what. Take care. Bye-bye.